In Mantua, high above the Piazza Sordello, swings an iron cage. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, it was usually occupied by a dead or dying man. The lords of Mantua had their quota of fratricide or treasonable sons and murderous uncles, of wives caught in adultery and killed for their crimes. Its citizens, as well as its princes, had their times of horror, their years of tribulation. Like all city-states, it was born in feudal anarchy and nurtured by interurban strife. These are the words of the eminent English historian J. H. Plum. Welcome back to the Violin Chronicles and to the story of Pietro of Mantua. This is part 2 of the life of Andrea Guarneri's eldest son. If you haven't yet listened to part 1, stop and go do that now, or you will be lost. But if you're all up to date, join me as we check in on Pietro and his young wife Caterina, newly moved to Mantua, a small yet significant dukedom in what today is northern Italy. Welcome to Mantua, home of the Gonzaga dukes, famed throughout Europe for their court rich in culture, art and music. The city of Virgil and adopted home of Monteverdi and now Pietro Guarneri. Today, the city of Mantua stands on the banks of 2 large lakes. But in Pietro's day, it was an island surrounded by lakes formed by the Mincio River. You could access Mantua by crossing one of its bridges or sailing in on a boat from the lower lake into Porto Catena. From here you could navigate with a smaller vessel into the heart of Mantua by making your way up the Rio, or small river, that traversed the city and up which fish and other products were brought into the town and sold at the market. Pietro Guarneri would have most likely entered by the large bridge of San Giorgio into the city, then winding his way through the streets with his wife and their belongings to find their lodgings. Pietro left his house and headed up the street towards the ducal palace. As he passed through the Piazza delle Erbe, he ducked under the porticos that lined the perimeter of the piazza, offering shelter from the bad weather. Bad weather that hadn't appeared to have scared off the market vendors selling their wares, yelling out their produce for all who cared to hear. He continued under the rows of arcades for a surprisingly short walk, almost in a straight line from his street towards the Piazza Sordello, taking him up to the culminating point of Mantua, to the palace. The click of Pietro's shoes on cobblestones was thanks to an important noble visitor to Mantua many years earlier, whom the Duke at the time had tried his best to impress with his fine palace and incredible artworks and culture, only to have the visitor complain of the mud in the streets and the square leading to the palace. In a fit of pique, the Duke had had the entire city paved, and so the thousands of stones leading from Pietro's house to the palace kept his clothing relatively unscathed by the elements. The city already had a reputation for being a hotbed of disease. Well, at least you could catch malaria or pneumonia without having your shoes or clothing caked in mud. Arriving at the Piazza Sordello, Pietro walked through the gate of St. Peter and kept on walking over the smooth river stones that paved the square. He could see the ducal palace on the right. In front of him stood the ancient cathedral of St. Peter, where even now, early in the morning, pilgrims were converging to get a glimpse of the holy relic housed in the church. The relic of the Holy Blood of Christ. Legend had it that it was taken to Mantua by Longino, the Roman soldier who struck Jesus in the chest. He collected the earth under the cross, mixed with the blood of Christ, and came to Mantua to preach the gospel. The cathedral is a mixture of Romanesque, Gothic and Baroque styles, and within is the final resting place of the Dukes of Mantua, and perhaps one day Pietro's boss. But he was not to know that his unstable patron would be the last of the Gonzaga dukes. Well, not yet anyway. Next to the Palazzo Acerbi, facing into the square, stood the Torre della Gabbia, the Tower of the Cage. Pietro shuddered as he glanced up at the cage perched high on the outer side of the medieval tower. Unfortunate criminals could and would find themselves imprisoned for all to see, literally hanging over the people's heads as a reminder of who ruled the city. The Piazza Sordello is not the bustling square that Pietro had just walked through, the Piazza delle Erbe, which was bursting with life and market stalls held by the citizens of the city. No, here in this piazza is the religious and political heart of the city, where you went to find the dukes and cardinals, pray for your eternal soul, or plan a warring campaign against your neighbours. Looking into the piazza were the facades of palaces of the ruling families of Mantua, but the most important and the epicenter of activity where any powerful person wanted to be was the ducal palace. And that was where Pietro was headed, carrying yet another instrument for the ducal collection under his arms. The present Duke and Duchess of Mantua were from the French line of Gonzagas. Well, he was anyway. And as such, Pietro made this set of instruments with beautifully inlaid fleurs-de-lis in the corners of the violins. By ordering these instruments decorated with the fleurs-de-lis, the Duke and Duchess of Mantua were clearly stating their alliance with the French for anyone who cared to look. Visiting nobles to the court of Mantua would see this symbol on the instruments played by the court musicians and understand where their allegiance lied, or who was funding the Mantuan court in any case. And as I mentioned, things were heating up in Europe between the Austrians, the French and the Spanish. Little old Mantua was placed in a very strategic position, and nothing says I'm French more than one of those little fleurs-de-lis. Now, have I mentioned that Ferdinando Carlo was a bit of a loser? Well, in all fairness, he hadn't been dealt the best hand in life, starting with the handicap in the form of his father, who to begin with was not the sharpest tool in the shed. Born himself from a syphilitic-ridden father, not the best start in life. Fortunately, the women of the family managed to make wise choices, saving the dukedom many times over. It is said of Ferdinando's father that, and I quote, his only recorded achievements were the enrichment of jewelers, pornographers, and Margherita della Rovere's relations. That was his favourite courtesan mistress, who he kept in a palace to help maintain his playboy lifestyle. Meanwhile, his wife, the Duchess, was running the shop with one of her chief advisors/lover, the Count Bulgarini, and so the little Ferdinando Carlo, who in the eyes of his mother could do no wrong, with the doting mother, no reliable role models, an open checkbook and spades of entitlement, there's no wonder he turned into a bit of a twat. He became Duke when he was still a minor, his father dying quite young at the age of 36, supposedly of malaria, but maybe syphilis like his father. It was said that his debauched and dissolute lifestyle was his ultimate undoing. But by the time the Guarneris had arrived in Mantua, Ferdinando had been in charge for the past 10 years, doing his best to run the dukedom into the ground. He was always in need of more finances for his long curly wigs, jewelled medallions and Mars-like armour he chose to strut around in, and for his favourite courtiers, courtesans, and his ceaseless debaucheries. And let's not forget court musicians, and why not have some lovely violins made as well? So what if he kept selling off bits of the dukedom? He needed lots of money, and he needed it now. So deals and treaties were made with the French to support his lifestyle. The French were his allies, his family, and the proof, in one very small way, was inlaid in the court instruments made by Pietro Guarneri and the fleurs-de-lis that adorn these violins. Time and time again, in political negotiations, Ferdinando would back the French, and almost every time his decisions would backfire. The man could not take a hint. He was so inept at managing affairs that even the French would ultimately give up on him, leaving him to his own devices. Pietro's court appointment was good news for Caterina and Pietro's ever-growing family. Their third daughter, Anna Maria Caterina, had only lived for 5 months, but since then she had had another 3 children. You'll be happy to know these 3 would live until adulthood, and at the time of Pietro's employment at the court, she was pregnant for the 7th time. If you're wondering, yes, that is 7 pregnancies in 8 years. Family planning appears to have been a mystery to the highly fertile Pietro and his wife. In 1685, with his financial position more stable, Pietro was able to help out his father in paying what remained of his little sister Elisabetta's dowry. Things appeared to be tight for the Cremonese Guarneris, and it was his family duty to chip in. Elisabetta was 25 years old now and finally leaving not just home but Cremona. 2 years ago, she had married a merchant called Giuseppe Sei, a nice Cremonese boy who had also moved to Mantua for work. This was the sister whom their father, Andrea, had had to borrow money for her dowry. Now that they were moving to Mantua, Pietro would see more of her, and his father also came for a visit. News from home is that Antonio Stradivari's business is becoming the prime workshop in town. Pietro's little brother, Giuseppe, is taking on more and more responsibilities in the workshop, and Andrea is beginning to feel his age. On a trip to Parma, he writes a will favouring the younger son, Giuseppe, and not forgetting that his eldest son, Pietro, left with no more as a by your leave. His eldest son would inherit the stricter minimum. Indeed he would. Well, that was eye-roll worthy for Pietro, who had just helped pay the rest of Elisabetta's dowry to help out the family. 2 years later, Elisabetta, Pietro's sister living in Mantua near them, travelled back to Cremona to visit the family. By this time, she had a young daughter who was growing up next to her cousins, the Mantuan Guarneri children. But on this trip home, tragedy struck, and Pietro's sister died, leaving her daughter and husband in Mantua. In 1689, in the latest correspondence he had received from his little brother, Giuseppe was making another cello with his father. It had beautiful wood and a rich brown varnish and was made smaller than most cellos were usually made, a bit like what Francesco Ruggeri was doing. This model was working well, and the musicians liked the way they could play more complex pieces of music being composed for the cello at the moment. On the large model bases, this would have been a bit trickier. A year after making this cello with his father, in 1690, Giuseppe, who is now 24 years old, married Barbara Franchi. Pietro most likely did not go to the wedding as he was very busy at the Mantuan court, and his wife was heavily pregnant with their 10th child. I say 10th child, but up to this point, only 5 of their children have survived over the age of 2. Pietro was walking down seemingly endless hallways once again. As he made his way through the ducal palace for a performance for the Duke Ferdinando Carlo, the extent of luxury in which the dukes lived was unimaginable to Pietro. Just one of these impressive oil paintings hanging on the walls of the palace in worth alone could feed his family for a lifetime. And there were literally hundreds of these artworks littering the palace, not to mention the frescoes. The clicking of his shoes on the marble floors echoed off high-domed frescoed ceilings as Pietro and other musicians weaved their way through corridors and galleries that joined over 500 rooms in the palace. At first he would get hopelessly lost in the labyrinth of luxury the Duke and Duchess of Mantua called home, but now he knew to stick to the other musicians and not get distracted by the bling. They quickly crossed another courtyard with finely manicured gardens and a gushing central fountain. Through colonnades and archways on they went. Nothing could have prepared Pietro Guarneri for the explosion of colour, texture and opulence he first faced when entering the services of the Duke of Mantua. As a musician, this was the most amazing place he had ever seen. Its fame throughout Europe as a court to rival that of the most cultured was not for nothing. The ducal palace was in fact not one, but a group of buildings, a suburb almost, comprising countless rooms, hallways, staircases, sitting rooms, bedrooms, receiving rooms, servant quarters, gardens, courtyards, and of course, rooms dedicated to entertainment and music. The courtyards, gardens, galleries, and arcades joined up over 30,000 square metres of palace, and there were 500 rooms, 22 courtyards, 7 towers, 4 gardens, 122 cottages or outhouses, 4 stables, 45 undergrounds. You didn't want to end up down there. A church and a theatre. No wonder Pietro was lost. But if you stopped and took a closer look, you would start to realise that these days cash was not so flush, and there was a discreet yet present decline in the standards the dukes were so well known for. The duke was perhaps not so powerful as his forefathers used to be, and they may not be in their golden period anymore. If things were starting to fall into disrepair and skimping had to be made, it was definitely not going to be the entertainment's budget. No way. Appearances were everything, and the Duke had to look after that gorgeous hair of his. In these years, Pietro was busy making violins and playing for his court appointment in Mantua. But a year after his little brother's wedding, Mantua was invaded. Of course, Pietro's wife was well into pregnancy number 11, and the atmosphere at court was so tense you could cut through it with a knife. As a court musician, Pietro was privy to all the details of what was going on, and it was unsurprisingly the Duke's mishandling of the situation that had put the entire population of the city in peril. The year is 1691. Well, if there was one thing the Duke of Mantua disliked more than being faithful to his wife, it was actual bodily harm, or the potential threat of harm. He did have that extravagant hair, remember? And now that threat was real. Remember that cousin of his wife's, Vincenzo, the one married to his sister-in-law and the so-called Duke of Guastalla? Well, he had gotten particularly cozy with the Spanish, always ready to undermine him, and now they were invading. This called for a quick retreat to Venice. Anna Isabella, the Duchess, could stay behind. It was her family mess that had got them here in the first place, anyway. Anyway, she was better at these things than him. Could the fact that Ferdinand had concluded a pact with Louis XIV of France, selling him that strategic little town of Casale, have anything to do with it? Ferdinand had got himself a nice little pension of 60,000 lire a year, a career as an army general, not that he planned to do any actual fighting, and a part in any future French conquests in Italy. I mean, could that have annoyed the Spanish? That whole Casale thing was a bit of a schmozzle when the king's minister, Count Ercole Mattioli, let the enemy know about the sale of the town. He was arrested by the French for leaking the information and maybe or maybe not becoming the infamous man in the Iron Mask. Then maybe there was that little thing with Guastalla where he had improved the fortifications of the city in the secret intent of selling the place to the French. That was just bad luck. The Spanish governor in Milan had visited and maybe guessed what he was up to and had that meddling Vincenzo come and take it all down. Okay, so perhaps the people of Mantua thought he was a bit of a douchebag for that, but the Spanish invading, he really had to get out of there, and slip out he did. Anna was going to be furious. Well, you've got to give it to her. Anna Isabella grabbed the Spanish bull by the horns, so to say, and in her husband's absence became regent. Ferdinand preferred the term regrouping to fleeing. Bands of Spanish soldiers were now swaggering through the city and terrifying its citizens. Andrea Guarneri did not need this stress at the moment. She was pregnant again. When was she not? And life was hectic enough as it was without this mess. The Duchess managed to calm the people of Mantua, organise their defence and negotiate peace treaties with Spain and the Spanish governor in Milan, Antonio Lopez, and the Viceroy of Naples. This all concluded in 1692, 1 year later. Ferdinand, of course, came slinking back after this was all put in place. They had lost Guastalla. Vincenzo was now named Duke, but Ferdinand knew his time would come. He would just have to wait. Philip Cass.
Ferdinando Vincenzo and Anna Isabella. Her husband was more or less kind of like a Verdi villain, an operatic, but he went out, he spent money, he got into all kinds of trouble. And the minute the war started, he ran off to Venice and he hid out there, leaving his wife to run affairs. She was actually the individual who hired Pietro Guarneri because Pietro's second wife was a member of her entourage.
Right. Yeah. She sounded great, Anna Isabella. Like he would, and multiple times he just ran away when there was conflict and she had to.
Always, yes.
She's like, oh man. In this same year, the Emperor Leopold I revoked the inheritance of the Duchy of Guastalla, which was transferred to Vincenzo Gonzaga. Ferdinand probably did well to run off to Venice and wait for Anna to cool down. Despite his pleading and petitioning of the emperor, he only managed to irritate him further, handing Guastalla over to his wife's cousin and reminding him that Mantua owed him 24,000 scudi. I would just lay low if I was Ferdinand at this point. By the time this all ended, it was 1692, and Pietro got word that his little brother Eusebio in Cremona had died, leaving a widow and 3 small children. And his younger brother Giuseppe had had his first child, a little Andrea. Giuseppe, who would in the future become known as Filius Andrea, would go on to have other children after the little Andrea, and amongst them was another Pietro Guarneri, who would move to Venice, and the last son, Bartolomeo Giuseppe Guarneri, aka Joseph Guarneri del Gesù, if I can do some name dropping. But these makers are for a future episode. For now, we will leave Pietro of Mantua, financially stable, yet sitting on a political firecracker. Pietro's family life also is about to be turned upside down very soon, and you will see how this new member of the Mantuan court handles the situation. Now, if you are not a Patreon member, I'm going to say goodbye at this point, but if you are one of my lovely Patreons, this show will continue as we look at what happens to both the cities of Mantua and Cremona, in which the Guarneri families are living, and this bonus chapter will do a lot in explaining how the lives of the Guarneris and Stradivarius evolved after 1700. And remember, this is when Stradivarius' golden period started. I'm wondering if these events could have influenced the Stradivari, and we will definitely see the effect on the Guarneris as well. I would like to say a big thank you to my lovely guest Philip Cass and to some new Patreon members, Nathan and Ian. Thank you very much for supporting the podcast. And if you would like to have access to all the episodes of The Violin Chronicles, please join us at Patreon, that's Patreon/The Violin Chronicles. But dear Patrons, let's see what happens next, shall we?